Welcome, everybody. I'm here for one of my stories. This is Lindsay Dunn, and I'm here with Jonathan Snipes. He has a background in theater, specifically theater sound design, and he teaches courses on that at UCLA. He's one of the founders of an experimental hip hop group named Clipping, and he has over 45 film scores listed on IMDb. Recently, he composed the film score for a horror documentary hybrid called Glitch in the Matrix, which is directed by Rodney Ascher and will be premiering at Sundance in just a few days. So, Jonathan, welcome to my Zoom call.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Let's start with your background as an artist. And I'm including there theater, composing, sound effects. How did you get drawn to the field of sound and music?
Well, I mean, I grew up in a really musical household. Like I always, like my mother's a violinist and my father was a great appreciator of music and played piano. And there was always a lot of classical music in the house. Like he loved both my parents love opera. And there were just always records on. And my dad was really into like big fancy stereos, so everything sounded pretty good, and I kind of just grew up with a love and understanding and appreciation for sound coming out of speakers. I am a fairly undisciplined person, so my forays into sort of traditional like instrument learning as a child were, I think, pretty frustrating for my parents because I just wouldn't practice. But I took all kinds of lessons and everything. I took violin lessons and trumpet lessons and bagpipe lessons and piano and voice and all of these different instruments. And I've always kind of, I mean, music has been in me, though I assumed because of my my lack of practicing rigor that it was never going to be a career for me. And I got drawn to theater primarily in high school. I immediately kind of became a theater kid, but I'd always loved plays. And I was like, I remember staging my own like production of Much Ado About Nothing in junior high, but I was sure I was going to be a writer, actor, director, right? And I mostly acted in high school and then did a lot of writing. And so when I applied to colleges, I applied as a playwright. By this point, I was making music on my computer for fun, because that felt like a way that I could really engage with the musical part of my brain and the computer programming part of my brain, which I'd also kind of been doing a little bit. I'm not a great programmer, but those seem to sort of intertwine. Like playing with the computer could mean playing a video game, could mean doing something in Microsoft Paint, or it could mean writing a piece of music, or it could mean like opening up the command line, like using the command line to open up the Doom, like the video game Doom, and replacing all the sounds in it. That's probably the first sound design I ever did, is just replacing all of the Doom sounds with Simpsons sounds or something stupid, And then a childhood friend of mine, the film composer Bear McCreary, he had finished up at USC, and then he started doing Battlestar Galactica almost immediately. And then he started hearing some of the electronic music I was making, and he said, "Hey, do you want to work on this film score?" And we did a horror movie together, which was Wrong Turn 2, where I like did a bunch of synthesizer sounds for his scores. And that's when I kind of started to say, "Oh, I know how I get how this like machine works of making film music." And then I scored a UCLA person's like a like person I knew from college's feature film, which ended up going to Sundance. And those credits, they're like post-production house who were doing these kind of very like sort of by paint by numbers kind of TV movies, just like making lots of these TV movies. And a friend of mine was editing that. He put my name in as a composer, and because they don't care who writes the music as long as it sounds like real music, they saw a couple of credits and was like, "Yeah, sure." And so I ended up scoring, I don't know, like 4 or 5 movies for them, miniseries and movies, where that's really how I learned to score movies. It was like, oh, I have 3 weeks to write 90 minutes of music. Here we go. Whereas like that's what taught me how to develop like templates and really kind of like turn a crank and come out with music.
So this is at least the third film you have scored for Rodney Ascher. How
Yeah.
did your collaboration begin, and how does your working relationship work with him?
A mutual friend of ours named Kevin Lee, who works in cartoons now. Uh, he at the time he was a theremin player in a band that I quite liked, and my band we'd played some shows together, and I had been in this. I guess I technically still am. It's not like we've hung it up. It's just been a few years since our last show, and who knows now. But I was in this horror movie score cover band called Nilbog, which
Okay.
is goblin spelled backwards, which is a reference to the movie Troll 2, that we had started as a goblin cover band, and we thought that was a funny name. But so we were playing like Goblin and Morricone and John Carpenter and Fabio Frizzi and Marauder and people like that. We were playing covers of those like sort of sci-fi and horror movie music from the 70s and 80s. Kevin knew about this, and then Rodney, not knowing me or not yet, asked Kevin to score his first movie, Room 237. And Kevin couldn't do it for whatever reason and said, "Oh, I can't do it, but who I think scores movies is this guy in these couple of bands that I know around LA. It's Jonathan." So he passed me along to Rodney, and I'm sure regrets it. Not that, I mean, he's got a better career than I am. What am I talking about? He's doing fine. um, um, but but I did sort of have a moment, when that film got into Sundance and started to actually look like it was doing some real things, that I was like, I sort of wrote Kevin and I was like, man, I'm sorry that you missed out on this. But like what's funny about Room 237 project is just looking at the emails that were coming in, it was like, okay, it's a friend of a friend who's making a documentary entirely out of found footage, right? So the likelihood that anyone will ever be able to see this beyond like YouTube is very, very slim, right? Because who can get the rights to actually do this? And has a budget of actually zero, right? Like literally zero. And so I was like, well, everything about this feels like the sort of project I should turn down, right? Like to score a movie for free that no one will ever see. I was like, and I was right in the middle of doing one of these like made for TV, like late night, miniseries at the time. And so I was very, very busy also. And then Rodney sent me like a 5-minute clip of the movie, and like 30 seconds into it, I said to myself, well, wait a minute. If I don't do this, what the hell am I doing with my career? Like this is the kind of movie I like, and this is the kind of thing I want to be attached to. So I think I just have to do it. I have to find a way to make it work. And obviously I'm really glad I did. Then since Rodney and I didn't really know each other, I brought in William Hudson to work on that movie with me too, because I was doing this other thing at the same time, and it was just like there was a lot of stuff happening all at once right then. I had a tour in the middle of working on both movies with my previous band. I remember being in like someone's living room in Poland and getting a phone call from Rodney telling me that the movie had gotten into Sundance. and so William, who was in the band clipping with me, wrote some cues for that movie as well. And it really it had much more of like a sort of traditional movie scoring mentality. Like the film was more or less done. But I, for the first time ever, didn't just score to picture like I was usually doing. Like usually what happens, right, is the movie is supposed to premiere in 3 weeks, and the producers realize that they haven't hired anybody to do the music, and so they find somebody, and you have 3 weeks to score this movie that's basically done, right? And that's the usual process on like a low budget movie. In this case, the cut was still sort of evolving, and so rather than score to picture, also because it was a documentary, it was my first feature-length documentary, I thought it would be interesting to try to write most of the music not to picture, which is not an uncommon thing for other people, but at the time it was for me. And so I kind of went through the movie and sort of made myself a list of like what I thought the different flavors of music were, for it. And then I wrote those cues without watching the movie while I was doing it. And then
Well, you said you went through the movie but without picture. Does that mean you were looking at a script or a transcript or something?
oh, sorry, no, there was a rough cut. But then when I wrote the music to go in these scenes, I didn't have picture up and I wasn't watching picture. I would just kind of watch the movie and I'd say like, okay, so this scene feels like it needs like a sort of slow plodding clock forward with like maybe a sort of heavy choir sound or something. And I would kind of write these like very text, like prose descriptions of what I wanted the music to be. And then I would just write that without looking back, you know?
Got you.
Um, which I did at the time as sort of a time saving technique. Um, but what I realized happened on that score, and I think one of the reasons that it was like my first score that anybody really sort of noticed is that I actually really ended up grounding the movie thematically really strongly. Like the score anyway, that there's a lot of coherency in that score. And it allowed me then the freedom of, once I had this kind of very clear spine of what all the themes were, to go back in and play inside of that structure in a way that's a little bit harder when you're just doing everything piecemeal, scene by scene. So that's a technique that then I continued with Rodney's movies. And when he approached me about the next one, The Nightmare, I had done a movie kind of in between. I'd done a few movies in between, but one in particular that that I had done for an old theater director friend of mine, who had asked me to not only do the score but also do the sound design, which I was kind of terrified to do because film sound design is so particular, and there's so many like standards and practices and things you have to worry about that you don't really have to worry about in theater, that I was just kind of, I agreed to do it because I knew that, because that director and I had worked together so much and we saw sort of eye to eye so well, that I knew I had the luxury of like making some mistakes, and I could say, oh, I really screwed this up and I need a few more days, and he wouldn't just fire me because we had this relationship already. And so once I'd done that movie and I'd done the sound and I'd kind of gotten a sense for how that side of things works, which I co-supervised that movie with a friend of mine, Jason Tuttle from grad school, who had gotten more into sort of the film sound side of things. I then said to Rodney, I said, hey, I think you should let me do the sound design for The Nightmare as well as the music. I think we could really accomplish some really incredible integration that that is harder to do with different department heads, you know. And that's been like how we've worked ever since. It worked out really well. It's a ton of work. I mean, I remember The Nightmare was like literally I'd be on a mixing stage with Jason all day mixing, like mixing the movie and doing things. And then I'd go home and say like, okay, I have to write the next 10 minutes of music so we can mix this segment tomorrow. And I would stay up all night writing music or like doing the notes that I had collected from the day's work. And like doing both at once it's a lot of work, but boy, you can really dial things in and really like have this beautiful seamless integration.
The next question was specifically about Glitch in the Matrix and your process for making that soundtrack. Is the process you just described where you're doing things, watching a cut and then looking, taking notes, is that the same process you used for Glitch in the Matrix, or how did you go about doing the score on this film once you knew you had the assignment?
Yeah. Well, what's cool about having such a close relationship with Rodney, right, is that I'm actually like, I'm involved really early. Like I'm actually kind of involved before the movie's even greenlit, usually, just because we talk and we're friends and I know what he's working on and I know what he's thinking about. And so I was able to start Glitch in the Matrix very early. And I was writing music almost just knowing the title and the general concept, before, like, he was still doing interviews and I could start writing. And I mean, the very first thing I did was I assembled a giant folder of like MP3s of other people's music for him that like spoke to me and felt like it sat in the world I imagined my score was going to, like, so that he could build a temp score. Like we could be on the same page, like if he needed music to edit to early on, that he was using things that I had kind of that I kind of had a relationship with. And then I started writing as well. I mean, by the first time I think I saw a full cut of the movie, there was a lot of my music already in it because I'd already been making things. It's the Room 237 process, but just elongated. You know, I think I probably wrote about 100 minutes of music for this movie before there was really a cut even. And then about half of that got thrown out, you know, and I wrote a bunch more music once there was a cut. I sort of filled in the connective tissue. And
What are some of the tools and instruments that you use to make the sounds that we will hear in Glitch in the Matrix?
oh man, all around me. Although right now I have this cookie sheet hanging in here that I was recording earlier, and I'm going to record when we're done with this call. I use a lot of old analog synthesizers, old and new, in my work. The main instrument, which is slightly off camera for you, I'll just rotate, is this sort of wall of modular synthesizers here. That is kind of, I would say, my main instrument, and most of the music I write kind of centers around it, and in some case starts with it. But this score was also very computery, and I was trying to make something that felt a little more like computer music than I usually do. Like usually I'm sort of, everything involves a computer in some way, but in this one I was really trying to like think of like computer techniques that felt interesting to me, like ways that music could feel like computer usage. So I wrote a little bit of like custom software in Max to do a few things here and there, and I wrote some like, I was also trying to play with like data compression and well audio compression specifically, right? Like we're all so used to now hearing these utterly terrible sounding, like garbagey, you know, like watery, crinkly streams of people's voices on things like Zoom or Skype or our cell phones or whatever. And all of these interviews in this film were recorded over Zoom or Skype or like video conferencing software. So they were full of these artifacts. And one way of dealing with those, right, is to attempt to remove them as much as possible and make things sound as good as you can. And then the other way of dealing with that, which is what I decided to do, was to add more of them and make it sound worse and really lean into that and try to find something about that aesthetic that then becomes beautiful. So I ended up doing a lot of like, I would take cues and convert them to like the worst quality MP3 over and over and over and over again and hope that like something kind of beautiful rose out of that. And sometimes it would, sometimes it wouldn't. I used a few tools to emulate that kind of destruction. There's a plugin called Lossy by this company called Good Hertz that I used so much that perhaps I should delete it and promise never to use it again because I used it so much on this score.
The press notes said that you were inspired by 90s electronic beats.
Yeah, that kind of like 90s big beat sound. Like I have always like, I've like, I don't know, my friends and I have a sort of shorthand for it. We call it hacker techno, which for me is related to probably one track by the Cosmic Commando, Mike Dredd, who was on Aphex Twin's label Reflex. He had an album called Laptop Dancing, I think is what it's called. It's a very stupid cover. But it's but there's one track on it called like the Hacker Crackdown or the Cracker Hackdown. I don't remember which one it is. I think it's the Hacker Crackdown, all spelled with K's, and it's very like leet, you know, hacker spellings, incredibly stupid. But I love that song so much, and I played it all the time. And it does have this kind of, it has this like kind of this like propulsive big beat, like break beats and acid lines, as if you're like zooming in virtual reality through the tubes that make up the internet kind of feel, you know?
Okay.
And so I was really excited about getting to play in that realm and to do that kind of a score. And I made a bunch of tracks. I made a few tracks like that, and it just ended up immediately, like it immediately felt totally inappropriate. That it's like, oh, it turns out you can't take like a quiet, like philosophical, sophisticated movie with a bunch of talking heads and fill it full of hacker techno. Apparently, that's a bad idea. But I had to start there, and a lot of those sounds and techniques stayed in the score. It just needed to clearly be like a quieter, more ambient, like sort of filmic approach to those ideas. I guess I always sort of suspected as much, but it was really fun to revisit all that stuff.
the movie score included 4 additional tracks that were not originally created by you. One of those being Che, performed by Suicide. I'm curious about that specific moment, but also maybe a bigger question is, how do you decide as a composer that I need to incorporate, rather than put an original sound here, I'm going to incorporate somebody else's music?
Usually that's not up to me, right? Like usually that's not my idea. The Suicide track was in the cut from the beginning, and that was what, sometimes I'll get a movie with a temp score, and there'll be a like a needle drop like that in the temp score, and I'll want to clarify. I'll say, hey, this song is working really well. Are you sure you want me to replace it, or do you want to try to license it? And sometimes they'll say, oh, no, that doesn't have any real meaning for me. I just, like the way it sounds, go for it. And it's funny, I actually did write something that I felt like was my attempt to replace that Suicide track, which got used in other places in the film. And there, Rodney loved that song, and I don't disagree. I think it's great, and it works really beautifully in the movie. And I was prepared to have to replace it because I suspected maybe we weren't going to get the license to use it, but we did. Earlier in the film, there's a scene in a church with a choir of sort of skeletons singing with their meat flaps, and I had to find a hymn for it, and I found this sort of almost sort of a joking little wink. I went through a bunch of hymns and found one that I thought was kind of a funny thing for them to be singing lyrically. That's literally about like asking God to. It uses the word circumcise in it, but it's to circumcise your body away from your soul, right? Is the sort of metaphor, so that you can like shed this sort of meat suit and move on to heaven. That I thought was very appropriate for the context of the movie. And so I thought, well, maybe this later scene, this scene, the Seattle hijacking scene, should all be another hymn, so I don't have to I don't have to write a new melody that has that kind of weight, that it can have an extra referentiality to it already, because people will know the hymn, or some people will, but it'll also feel kind of somber, and it'll feel sort of funerary. And I just couldn't find anything. I must have tried 20 or 30 hymns out, and I just couldn't find anything until I was flipping through this book of English part songs that I had borrowed from my mother's house, that I thought was an interesting book. And I ran into this piece by Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan. That's like a beautiful 4-part vocal harmony, like a part song, called "The Long Day Closes," and it really, like, I don't know, it moved me in a way that like a song hasn't moved me in a while. I was very like sort of emotionally affected by it, and the lyrics, I forget the name of the lyricist now, but just really stunning little turns of phrases, the "go to the dreamless bed, thy book of toil is read," right? Like your book of toil is over, the long day closes. And I thought it just sat there beautifully. And so I made a little robot voice sing it very slowly and carefully over this scene. But boy, it took a long time to get there.
Thank you so much for talking to me. And if people want to follow your work, how can they find you and keep up with your work, whether it's theater or film, or what? Do you have any social media things you can promote for us?
I'm not the most active person on social media, but I do maintain my Instagram fairly regularly, which I think you would find just by searching my name. And I spell it with, in my social media handles, I spell it with an 8 between the T and the H, which is a very like pretentious practice I adopted in high school and I've stuck with. So it's JONAT 8 HAN. And then it's that same JONAT 8 HAN.com for my website that is actually fairly well updated. And the contact link there is an email directly to me. But if you want to know what I'm actually up to day to day, Instagram is kind of the best thing. I don't really post a lot of like, this is what I ate for dinner, but I will say like, oh, I have a play happening this weekend, or this movie is happening or something like that.
You also have Bandcamp and a SoundCloud, these kinds of things that people could.
My Bandcamp, I'm a little behind, but I've been doing an album a month, which I did all last year. I did an album every month on my Bandcamp of like sketches, works in progress, field recordings, like things that I'm having a series I'm calling Work Study. That was sort of always kind of like this is that imposter syndrome talking again, but I've always kind of beaten myself up a little bit about not feeling like I have a rigorous practice, like in the way that an arts practice, like you hear writers talk and you're like, well, you sit down and you write for 4 hours every day and that's what you do. And then eventually a book comes out. And I just don't work that way. I don't make music that way at all. And I've always kind of like thought of that as a failing. And so I set out to make this album every month. And I realized a couple of months into it, I'm totally doing that. I'm just not doing it in these regular blocks, but I am making work constantly, whether or not I have a project, and there is a constant stream of output. And it was incredibly easy for me to pull together an album every month.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you this evening, Jonathan, and I look forward to seeing how people react to Glitch in the Matrix and what your career holds. Thank you so much for speaking to me this evening.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure.
All right, everyone, good night.